1960. The Aral Sea, Central Asia. 400 fishing boats working those waters on any given morning. Processing plants along the shore turning out 40,000 tons of fish a year. The sea itself stretched across 68,000 square kilometers, large enough that a sailor crossing it could lose sight of the opposite shore for hours. The winds off the water kept the surrounding steppe cooler in summer, wetter in spring. An entire way of life had grown up here, town by town, over centuries. That was 1960. By 2003, the water was simply gone. Where sailors had navigated open sea, rusted ships sat in sand 30 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. Where fish processing plants had run through the night, there were abandoned buildings filling with salt dust blown in off the exposed seabed. The sea that had been one of the 4 largest lakes on Earth had lost more than 90% of its water volume. In August 2005, Kazakhstan closed a 13-kilometer dam across what remained of its portion of the sea. 7 months later, the fish came back. I have walked a lot of dead country in 34 years. Dry creek beds, stripped hillsides, ground too compacted to take a footprint. Some of it healed. A lot of it did not. The Aral Sea is the largest ecological collapse I have ever looked at closely, and the part of the story that most accounts leave out is the part that tells you something real about how recovery works. The dam. What the water did once it had somewhere to stay. But this story does not start with the dam. It starts with cotton. In the early 1960s, Soviet planners decided the 2 rivers that fed the Aral Sea, the Amu Darya running through the south and the Syr Darya through the north, could be doing more productive work than keeping a lake full. The land around them was dry and flat. Cotton liked dry and flat. So they built canals. Thousands of kilometers of canals, irrigation networks that pulled water out of both rivers and sent it across the desert floor to grow cotton for Soviet textile factories. Nobody ran the numbers on the sea. Or if they did not share the results with anyone positioned to act on them. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the sea began to shrink. The inflows that had always replenished it dropped by half, then by more than half. The water that remained grew saltier as it concentrated. By the early 1980s, fish catches in the Aral were falling sharply. By 1982, the sea had split into 2 separate bodies. A northern portion inside Kazakhstan, fed by the Syr Darya, and a southern portion inside Uzbekistan, fed by the Amu Darya. Neither was receiving enough inflow to stay stable. By the late 1980s, the fishing industry was finished. The towns along the shore had been built for a working sea. Aralsk in Kazakhstan had been a functioning port for generations. Muynak in Uzbekistan had a fish cannery that once processed thousands of workers and shipped product across the Soviet Union. The cannery closed. The ships, too large and heavy to move economically, were left where they sat in the receding shoreline. What replaced the water was salt flat. 80,000 square kilometers of it, crusted with fertilizer residue and pesticide from decades of irrigation runoff, carried back into the basin by return flow. When the wind came, which it did reliably, it picked up the salt and the chemicals and carried them 300 kilometers in any direction. Livestock sickened downwind. Crop yields in surrounding areas dropped. Studies conducted in the 1990s documented elevated rates of throat cancer, respiratory illness, and infant mortality in communities near the exposed seabed. Doctors in Karakalpakstan, the Uzbek region bordering the South Aral, were seeing diseases they had not seen before. This was not hidden from the world. International environmental reports had been tracking the collapse since the 1980s. The question was not whether anyone knew. The question was whether anyone with the authority to change anything considered it their problem to solve. For decades, the answer was no. By 2000, the North Aral had lost well over half its water volume from its 1960 baseline. The sea level had dropped close to 25 meters. The Syr Darya, the river that could still reach the northern basin, was delivering a fraction of its historical volume after decades of upstream irrigation withdrawals. Without intervention, the trajectory was clear, and the clock had already started. In 2001, Kazakhstan signed onto a regional program to address the Aral Sea basin, with support from the World Bank. The committed funding for the specific dam project came to $86 million. The plan was built around one structure, a physical barrier, a dam, across the Berg Strait, the narrow passage that connected the North Aral to the south. The idea was not to save the entire Aral Sea. The southern portion, sitting mostly inside Uzbekistan, was already considered beyond realistic rescue without dismantling the cotton irrigation economy of an entire nation. The plan was narrower than that. Hold the water still reaching the North Aral inside it. Stop it bleeding south through the strait and evaporating into the larger southern basin. Give the Syr Darya's remaining flow somewhere to accumulate instead of somewhere to disappear. 13 kilometers of concrete and earthen dam. The Kok-Aral Dam. One structure across one strait. International experts argued about whether it was worth building. Optimists said the North Aral could recover to something meaningful. Skeptics said the dam would hold water for a generation before things returned to where they had started, because the root cause of the problem, the river diversions, would remain untouched. Neither side was entirely wrong, and that was not even the part that got people angry. Some officials and environmental groups argued that by sealing the North Aral off from the south, Kazakhstan was actively sacrificing the southern basin. Taking water that had been moving naturally through the Berg Strait and keeping it in one country's portion, which was, mathematically, accurate. What entered the North Aral would now stay in the North Aral. The same water that had been slowly bleeding south through that strait for 40 years was about to become the entire foundation of a recovery. The engineers who worked on the Kok-Aral Dam site said later they had not been entirely certain the structure would hold against the water pressure they expected once it began backing up behind the barrier. There were questions about the foundation geology, about whether the earthen sections would settle the way the models predicted. Construction finished in August of 2005. The water rose faster than anyone had modeled. Within 8 months of the dam closing, the water level in the North Aral had risen 3 meters, not centimeters, 3 meters. The salinity, which had been sitting at around 30 grams per liter before the dam, a concentration too high for most freshwater fish species to survive, began to drop. By spring of 2006, it was approaching 10 grams per liter in parts of the basin, and the fish came back. Which, looking back, was either a vindication of basic ecological principles or a genuine surprise to nearly everyone who had modeled the situation. Pick one. They were not stocked from a hatchery, though Kazakhstan would later do supplemental stocking as well. The first fish came back because the conditions that had made the water uninhabitable had shifted fast enough that the species which had retreated to the deeper, fresher reaches of the Syr Darya river system simply swam back in when the water changed. Bream, pike perch, carp, species that had been present in the Aral Sea before the collapse and had been pushed back into the river by the salinity. 7 months after the dam was sealed, fishermen who had not cast a net in the North Aral in 2 decades reported fish in the water. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense to people who have not spent time watching watersheds. It was not just the fish. The fish came back because the water quality changed. The water quality changed because the dam held the inflow instead of letting it bleed south. But what nobody had fully accounted for was how quickly the system, left to its own chemistry, would begin doing things no one had specifically planned for. Aquatic vegetation returned before the fish did. Phytoplankton bloomed as the salinity came down. The phytoplankton fed the zooplankton. The zooplankton fed the small fish. The small fish gave the larger fish something worth swimming back for. In 12 months, the ecological cascade in the North Aral looked different than any of the pre-construction projections had suggested. The recovery was moving faster, across more species than the models had been built to expect. The first commercial catch out of the North Aral, in 2006, was small enough to go almost unnoticed by anyone outside the region. That would not stay small. By 2007, a fish processing facility in Aralsk, the same city that had watched its port turn into a sandflat over the previous 30 years, was back in operation, running at a fraction of Soviet-era capacity, but with workers, with product, with a supply chain beginning to reconstruct itself around something real. By 2010, annual catches from the North Aral were being measured in thousands of tons. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. The water edge was moving toward Aralsk. The city had been built as a port. At its peak in the mid-20th century, ships had docked within its boundaries. By 1990, the water was 60 kilometers away. By 2003, the nearest shoreline was more than 100 kilometers from the city center, and there were rust-colored ship hulls visible in the sand at the edge of town, sitting where the harbor had once been, as a kind of monument to what had left. But as the North Aral refilled, that direction reversed. Slowly, without anything close to the speed at which the collapse had happened, the waterline began moving back toward the city. And somehow, it keeps going. Vegetation took hold on the former seabed, grasses first, then shrubs. The salt flat that had been lifting pesticide into the air across the steppe for 3 decades was stabilizing under plant cover, the root systems binding the surface that wind had been stripping for years. Saiga antelope, a Central Asian steppe species that had largely abandoned the region when the lake died and the habitat degraded around it, began appearing at the margins again. Migratory waterfowl that had stopped using the region showed up in numbers that regional wildlife surveys had not expected. Nobody had designed any of that. The dam held the water. The rest of the system used it. By 2016, the North Aral surface area had increased by roughly 50% from its 2003 low point. The water level had risen more than 12 meters from where it stood when the dam was sealed. Salinity across most of the basin had dropped into the range that supports a functioning fish population. The Aralsk Fishing Cooperative, which had not existed in any meaningful form for more than 20 years, was employing several hundred people. Here is the honest reckoning. The South Aral does not have this story. The Amu Darya was never redirected back to the sea. Uzbekistan's agricultural economy still depends on the irrigation canals that drain it. The southern basin, which was always the larger of the 2 portions of the Aral Sea, has continued to shrink. What remains of it is shallow, extremely saline, and largely lifeless. Small pockets of water persist in the deepest depressions, but they bear no resemblance to what was there before. The Aral Sea as it existed in 1960 is gone, and the southern portion will almost certainly not come back in any form resembling what it was. The North Aral's recovery is real. It is also partial, bounded, and dependent on 2 things holding: the dam, and enough Sir Darya flow continuing to reach the sea from upstream. Neither is guaranteed indefinitely. The upstream nations still divert the river for agriculture. If those withdrawals increase significantly, or if the dam fails, the clock restarts. A 13-kilometer dam bought back one portion of one of the largest water bodies lost in a century of environmental damage. The bar was low, and it still took real work to clear it. What I take from the North Aral, after looking at it for a long time, is something a lot of recovery stories resist saying plainly. This was not a restoration. The sea that existed in 1960 is not coming back. The fishing boats are not coming back. The communities along the South Aral are not recovering. Nobody released anything to make this happen. Nobody healed anything in the complete sense of that word. What Kazakhstan did was hold the line. They identified the piece of the system that could still be held, and they held it. The water reaching the North Aral was not going to keep bleeding south. One structure. 13 kilometers of concrete and compacted earth across a strait that nobody had thought to dam for 40 years of decline. The real question is not whether the North Aral Sea came back. It did. The question is, what happens to the south, and whether the governments that control those rivers will look at what held together in the north and decide that 40 years of collapse is long enough. That question does not have an answer yet. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. If these stories stay with you, subscribe. We put a new one out every week. And if there's a place near you that came back, a wetland, a creek, a hillside, I would like to hear about it in the comments. One more thing. What happened in Kazakhstan with that dam is the same kind of cascade I keep coming back to. If you want to see it at a different scale, in a different country, with a different animal entirely, there is a video right now on this screen about 14 wolves put into Yellowstone in 1995, and what those wolves did to the rivers. Tap it on the end card and keep watching.